I normally charge $500 an hour for this.
Oh, really?
So depending on how long we're on this phone, you can realize what you're getting for free. Uh,
Hello and welcome, and first off, my sincere gratitude for your interest in intangible things. This interview with retired officer John Flood contains some of the more consequential details I've uncovered as part of a larger research project investigating the unsolved murder of my biological grandfather, Terry Zilligan, on March 14th, 1964. So please bear with me while I provide some details up front. I want to give the best possible context for John Flood's story, which is truly something. So my grandfather, Terry Zilligan, was a television salesman at the Sears Roebuck department store in the Golf Mill Shopping Center. That's located in Niles, Illinois. But in March '64, one day, Zilligan tried to stop 3 burglars from robbing his employer. Unfortunately, he was shot point blank and killed for his brave attempt in doing so. News of this tragic and unnecessary shooting sent shockwaves throughout Chicagoland. But given that it happened almost 60 years ago, a proper reinvestigation and re-examination of the facts requires a strong sense of careful stewardship. So, to make sure I don't miss any new information, I periodically plug in key search terms and names into every page and site available to me. And a year or so ago while doing this, I saw a comment on a Chicago Mob History Facebook group from John Flood, and immediately knew I had to get in touch with him about a story he was sharing. It involved the arrest of the local police's top suspect in Terry Zilligan's murder, Paul Painsko, otherwise known as Peanuts. John Flood and I have had several conversations since, but ultimately we set up an interview since I wanted to get his firsthand account on the record. This interview was recorded via Zoom on January 23rd, 2022. I first asked John what he remembers about Terry Zilligan's murder in 1964 when John was in the Cook County Sheriff's Police.
when the robbery happened, because of the fact of the killing, it became even more famous amongst police because of the fact there was a murder involved, not just an armed robbery.
When a murder takes place, the local police department has jurisdiction. In this case, that was the village of Niles, Illinois. The lead detective in charge was Lieutenant Edward Dennis, a well-respected officer with a solid reputation in Chicagoland. Terry Zilligan's murder was widely covered by the press. Dennis and the Niles Police Department were under a lot of pressure to find the killer. Top suspects included Joseph DiArgento, Michael LaJoy, and Paul Peanuts Painsko. Lieutenant Dennis seemed to have his sights set on Paul Peanuts Painsko, who by '64 was the most well-known burglar in Chicago and probably the United States.
The men that you have mentioned in discussion, like DiArgento, LaJoy, those guys, they were all tied in with Paul Pensko. Pensko was the titular leader of those guys. Anybody knowledgeable would have thought that those guys were part of what happened. Pensko's guys were like Butch Cassidy's guys at Sundance Kid, where he has a group of guys that everybody knows are doing the jobs.
Right.
They were like a gang of guys that, would hit hijacking, stuff like Sears, Brinks trucks. That's what they did. And they did it all over the country. They were some of the top heist men in the United States.
A crew of those top heistmen had zeroed in on the Golf Mill Sears on March 14, 1964. But Terry Zilligan, a television salesman and former rugby player, thwarted their plan. As they ran out of the store, Zilligan tackled the man with the loot and pinned him down. Another burglar went up to Terry from behind, shooting him in the back, saving his partner from being caught, but killing Terry.
When I heard about that, I thought it was an absolute shame that they killed a guy. And that shows you the type of men that they are. Because in my mind, they're dirty, vicious men.
Dirty and vicious indeed. But would professional burglars, as Flood described them, really shoot to kill like that?
I don't think Pansko would have done that. I don't think he just wouldn't. It wasn't his nature. The world that did it was nervous.
Nervous.
He's not good at what they do there. Sometimes you give them a pistol and some of those guys, they get a little nervous, that's all.
Nervous. So was Terry Zilligan's assailant more of an amateur rather than a professional burglar? Yet the Niles police had just fingered one of the most professional burglars in the country as Zilligan's assailant, and these juxtaposed theories had consequences. Lieutenant Dennis of Niles became so certain that Painsko was Zilligan's assailant, he even prematurely told the victim's family that Painsko was most likely who killed Terry. But County Patrolman John Flood and his partner Sergeant James Walsh weren't at all convinced that Painsko was Zilligan's assailant. They knew Painsko personally, and as John just alluded to, didn't think it was in Painsko's nature to kill.
So one night, I'm coming in, and Walsh and I were like partners. Walsh says to me, "You know what, Painsko's hanging around." I said, what's going on? What do you want? He says, "Well, we want to pick him up." He says, "Dennis got a warrant that nobody knows about." He says, "And it's a murder warrant."
So Lieutenant Dennis secures an arrest warrant for Paul Painsko in June of 1964. The charge was murder. At the time, if a municipality in the Chicago area possessed an arrest warrant for a major crime like murder, the neighboring jurisdictions and the county police would have been made aware of the warrant just to keep a lookout or help aid in the arrest. But Niles' police warrant for Painsko's arrest had not been communicated to neighboring police forces.
Because normally when you have a warrant, murder warrant, it was put out, in those days, it was like an all points bulletin, being the fact that they had it, and that had not happened.
If Dennis had just followed procedure, several police forces would have been looking for Painsko's green Cadillac on their streets and ultimately helped the Niles police arrest Painsko. But something else was up, according to John Flood. By the time Walsh approached Flood, it had been 3 weeks since Dennis secured the warrant from a judge. How could an experienced cop like Dennis make such an egregious mistake? According to John Flood, there was no mistake being made.
In those days, when cops went after a guy on a murder or something like that, they frequently had in their mind that they were going to kill the guy they were going after.
In summary, Sergeants Flood and Walsh had surmised that instead of working with neighboring police departments to arrest Painsko, Lieutenant Dennis was working with Chicago policeman William Hanhart to assassinate Painsko.
Walsh and I had discussed relative to the warrants and what we thought might be happening.
And what'd you think was happening there with Dennis
we
and
were
the warrant?
discussing if he had the warrant, nobody knows about it. There's something's up, and whatever Dennis might have been planning, he might have been taking hand on along with him.
According to Flood, William Hanhart would have been pulling the strings on an operation like this, not Dennis.
Hanhart's control, especially as he went along, he controlled everything from Milwaukee to South Bend, Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
About 10 million people, where the cops are involved in.
Sure.
And he was the most major police officer in the Chicago Police Department. So if Dennis had the warrant, he might have, with that warrant, gotten the whole of Hanhart. And Hanhart had already killed a few guys in the city to begin with.
Would Paul Painsko be Hanhart's next target? Flood knew where Peanuts might be hanging around, so he and Walsh went to track him down before Dennis and Hanhart could first.
So I said, "Well, let's go. We'll go down. Come with me." And what we're snatching Painsko. I know where he hung out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We spot Paul's car in one of the coffee shops. So we sit out and we wait. He gets out, gets in the car. Walsh and I stop. And he knows who we are. Okay, because we've met before.
Sure.
So when he gets out of the car, he's like, "What are you busting my balls for?" And he said, what are you arresting me for?" And I jokingly said, "We're saving your life."
But Flood wasn't really joking. He and Sergeant Walsh had surmised that Painsko had been sentenced to be killed by both Chicago Police Sergeant William Hanhart and Niles Police Lieutenant Ed Dennis. And what solidified Flood and Walsh's theory was what happened after they picked up Painsko.
We knew what we arrested him for. He didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because the warrant was secret. Okay, So he didn't know it. And he thought, we were playing him around. But when he was in the car and we were driving back, I think he knew we were serious, that something serious was going on. And then when we got to the station, I think that's when we divulged to him that they got a murder warrant for you for the Sears job. So Walsh and I go up to the second floor, where we're in a private office. Walsh gets on one line, and I'm on the other, and he's calling Niles. And he says to him, would you have Lieutenant Dennis call us relative to a warrant in his possession?
With Painsko finally in custody, they left a message at the Niles police station for Lieutenant Dennis. Dennis called them back immediately, acting very suspiciously.
When we get the call, this guy calls from downstairs and Lieutenant Dennis is online. So both of us pick up the phone. Walsh is doing the talking. He says, how do you do it? He says, we'd like to have the murder warrant, the warrant. And Dennis said to him, what warrant? And I remember that because it was cute. He said, what warrant? Walsh said, the warrant you have for Paul Pansco for murder. Oh, he said, oh, that warrant. God's honest truth.
God's honest truth. At first, Lieutenant Dennis had denied he had a warrant for Painsko in his possession. When he finally admitted to having the warrant, Flood and Walsh arranged to turn custody of Painsko over to him without bloodshed. But Dennis's behavior solidified to Flood and Walsh that he had a scheme to kill Peanuts up his sleeve.
He was surreptitious in the first couple of minutes of the phone call, maybe 2 minutes before Walsh told him, the murder warrant for Pansco because we got him, man.
He was kind of trying to hide it, right? He was trying to hide the fact that he had the warrant.
What warrant?
What warrant?
And I believe in my surmising, and Walsh did too, that Paul was going bye-bye, and they found him with that piece of paper. They were downstairs talking to Paul. We bring him upstairs, and he's, he's talking about all the shit that he's going to have to go through. And we told him, I said, well, once again, we told him, I said, you should be happy.
Should be happy.
We were thinking they were going to assassinate him. So
yeah,
that was our evaluation of what was going on. But I think Pansco was like, yeah, they were going to do something nasty to me. But then again, shooting somebody like Pansco in those days, you're probably doing the world a favor.
Let's say this plan did take, did go forth, and they pull Pansco over, and he shoots him on sight. What would that have done for Lieutenant Dennis's career?
I use an analogy. Most famous things that people who shot Billy the Kid. You had a marshal by the name of Pat Garrett that became famous because he shot Billy the Kid. So whoever would have shot Pansco would have had a big reputation.
Although he was a highly respected policeman, Ed Dennis never would be compared with the likes of Pat Garrett after all. Niles police never closed the Zilligan murder case, but in September '68, Dennis referred to Painsko's arrest as a partial solution to the case. Lieutenant Dennis remained convinced in Peanuts' guilt. Had he been so convinced that he was prepared to assassinate the infamous burglar in the streets? A grand jury, however, decided to not indict Pansco, and he was not prosecuted for the murder of Zilligan. If Hanhart and Dennis had successfully assassinated Pansco in July '64, Pansco would have been widely acknowledged as Zilligan's assailant. But because Flood and Walsh intervened, Pansco was arrested for the murder of Terry Zilligan without any shots being fired. Another significant consequence of their intervention is that evidence supporting Michael LaJoy as Terry Zilligan's assailant may have never come to light, evidence which I have covered and will continue to cover extensively on the Intangible Things Facebook page. But the name Michael LaJoy is nowhere to be found in Niles Police's remaining records. Obtained via FOIA request, the Niles Police case file on Terry Zilligan's murder only contains information pertaining to Paul Peanuts Pansco and Joseph DiArgento. Meanwhile, Flood and Walsh never forgot what they witnessed that night.
anytime that subject come up with Pasco, we smiled about the fact that it would probably saved his life.
You guys knew it. Wow. Wow.
Just looked at what I was talking about as a normal night.
Yeah.
I didn't look at it as any big deal.
Yeah. Well,
I
to
mean,
me, it's a huge deal, even all these years later, to hear you just talk about that one, night in July.
The goal of the Intangible Things Project is to cast a wide enough net to find those few remaining persons who could provide details on this unsolved case. Sharing and inviting is encouraged. As always, I welcome those who have watched this video to contradict my own, admittedly personal biases as I continue to research and share with you what I have found. Thank you for watching.